A lot of attention has been given in the last couple of weeks to what's been going on in Egypt. And nobody really knows what's going to happen ultimately there. But I'd like to at least address with you the subject in general of the Middle East and Bible prophecy. You see, 100 years ago, this was the biggest thing that Adventist preachers talked about, was the subject of the Eastern question. There was evangelist after evangelist talking about Armageddon and Daniel chapter 11, verse 45. That was their biggest subject. We don't even talk about it anymore in our evangelistic meetings. We talk about Daniel 2, we talk about Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, we talk about Revelation. We don't talk about Daniel 11. We do sometimes when one of us gets brave to talk about it in our church, but it's not something that's the main push. Now this is from Bible Readings for the Home Circle, 1890 edition, the Eastern Question. And the focus on Daniel 11:45. He shall come to his end and none shall help him. And here's the map. And it says here at the beginning, the 11th chapter of Daniel entire is a literal historical prophecy, the longest and most remarkable of its kind in all the Scriptures. This was big. This was the biggest thing. You won't find this in the present edition of Bible Readings. And a literal historical prophecy. You see, Daniel has 3 symbolic prophecies, main outline prophecies. You've got chapter 2, the image with the different metals. Chapter 7, the 4 beasts. Chapter 8, you've got a ram and a he-goat, and then what happens with that goat and its horns, and then you have another little horn coming up. That's the symbolism found in the book of Daniel. But when you get to chapter 11, no symbols. It's just straightforward. You've got a king doing this, and then another king does this. It doesn't name them by name, but when you compare the Scriptures with history, you can identify who it's talking about. King does this, and then the king does this, and then the king does this, and then the king does this. It's just straightforward, literal language. And 100 years ago, that was a big subject among Seventh-day Adventist ministers. The early Adventist view of Daniel 11 was that verses 5 through 13 were talking about the divisions of the Greek Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. Primarily, it goes into focus on the king of the north and the king of the south. Then in verse 14 through 30, our early Adventists understood this as referring to Rome. And then in verses 30 to 35, they understood that as the Roman papacy. Verses 36 to 39, they understood as looking at revolutionary France. This was the view of most Seventh-day Adventist ministers 100 years ago. And then verses 40 to 45, they understood as representing the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And this was how they looked at it. So we're going to look at a brief overview of the history of Adventist interpretation of Daniel 11, verses 40 to 45. You have a king of the north and a king of the south. The king of the north was the Ottoman Sultan. The king of the south were the Egyptian rulers. That's the way they understood it. And this is how they saw those 6 verses. Verse 40, maybe you can just open your Bible to Daniel 11, verse 40. It says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Verse 44, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. Daniel 11 verse 45 says, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end and none shall help him. That's the passage we're talking about. And Uriah Smith and all of our other early expositors of this passage saw Napoleon as the him of verse 40. And then they saw the Ottomans and the British fulfilling verses 41 to 43. Then they saw the Crimean War fulfilling verse 44. There's the dates up here for these. 1853 to 1856 was the Crimean War. And then everything had happened up through verse 44, and then they were just waiting for verse 45. So the Adventist preachers were showing how everything had happened all the way down through verse 44, and all we're waiting for is verse 45 to happen. And so they had great anticipation of a very soon return of Jesus, because this is the last verse of the chapter. Uriah Smith in 1871 wrote, all eyes are now turned with interest toward Turkey, and the unanimous opinion of statesmen is that the Turk is destined soon to be driven from Europe. Time will soon determine this matter, and it may be but a few months. S.N. Haskell, 1908. I'm just giving you a few. There's lots of them we could quote. Haskell said, even the Turks themselves are looking forward to the time when they will have to remove their capital from Constantinople to Jerusalem. All know that when the Turk steps out of Constantinople, there will be a general breaking up of Europe. They may not name the impending conflict the Battle of Armageddon, but God has so named it. 1908. That was what was being taught. F.M. Wilcox, just as World War I is beginning, wrote, the scriptures indicate that eventually the site of government will be removed to the glorious holy mountain between the seas, referring evidently to Jerusalem. The river Euphrates, representing the Ottoman government, is rapidly being dried up, that the way of the kings of the East may be prepared to take part in the great battle of Armageddon. We don't teach these things this way anymore, do we? 100 years ago, that's the way Seventh-day Adventists understood this prophecy. Just waiting for verse 44 to take place. For 45. They believed 44 had already happened, and 45 was all that was going to happen. And then verse 1 of chapter 12, the very next verse says, and at that time shall Michael stand up. You have the time of trouble and God's people delivered. So they saw this as a very important prophecy. This map is from a 1901 edition of Uriah Smith's book, Daniel and the Revelation. Here's the map of the area there at that time. This is what it looked like. Here is Israel, Jerusalem, right here. And so the king of the north and the king of the south are still in position here. This is the king of the north. This is the king who held power north of Israel. In fact, the Ottoman territory extended way down into Arabia at that time. Theirs was the king of the south down here, Egypt. So this was the king of the north and the king of the south. And at that time, when this map was drawn, these were the borders, and they were anticipating. Here's Constantinople over here. It's in Europe. But it's still Turkey, because Turkey goes way over here at that time. Still is in Europe a little bit, but not this much. And so they were seeing that there was a lot of pressure being put on Turkey, and it was going to drive Turkey out of Constantinople, which was at that time the headquarters, the capital of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire. And it was going to make them abandon their European territory. Where else would they set up their headquarters but in Jerusalem? And that's how they saw Daniel 11 verse 45 was that when that happened, when the king of the north sets up the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, then he would come to his end and none would help him, and Michael would stand up, the great prince would stand for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even in that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So this is what they were preaching. For nearly 50 years, Adventist ministers predicted that the Turks would soon be pushed out of Europe and move their headquarters to Jerusalem. But following World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, Palestine was placed under British mandate, and the new Republic of Turkey set up its capital at Ankara. Things didn't turn out the way they had been predicting them to happen. So notice what's happened to Turkey. It's shrunk down. You've got all these new countries coming in here. You've got Syria, you've got Lebanon, you've got Palestine. It was then placed under British mandate. This up here, Syria, and that area was under French mandate. Turkey didn't have any access to Jerusalem anymore. It had to move its capital from Constantinople, but it still remained up there in Anatolia. So, what do you do now? Well, Adventists finally abandoned their belief in Turkey fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel 11:40-45. All the standard Adventist books were edited to remove the Turkey view. And here's the 1944 edition, if you can see it there, of Daniel and the Revelation. If you read that and any subsequent edition of Daniel and the Revelation, that whole view is taken out. So then we started paying attention to James White's caution that he wrote in 1877. He said, in the exposition of unfulfilled prophecy, where the history is not written, the student should put forth his propositions with not too much positiveness, lest he find himself straying in the field of fancy. There are those who think more of future truth than of present truth. They see but little light in the path which they walk, but think they see great light ahead of them. Positions taken upon the Eastern question are based upon prophecies which have not yet met their fulfillment. Here we should tread lightly and take positions carefully, lest we be found removing the landmarks fully established in the Advent movement. It may be said that there is a general agreement upon this subject, and that all eyes are turned toward the war now in progress between Turkey and Russia as the fulfillment of that portion of prophecy which will give great confirmation of faith in the soon loud cry and close of our message. But what will be the result of this positiveness in unfulfilled prophecies should things not come out as very confidently expected is an anxious question. Review and Herald, November 29, 1877. So, after things didn't work out with the Ottoman Empire, Adventist ministers just kind of quieted down, and we stopped talking about it, and we started taking this seriously. And then, a few years ago, new views started coming in. We got to thinking, the other plan didn't work out. What if we make these powers, King of the North and King of the South, spiritual powers? And so we started changing it from literal to spiritual, trying to identify what's going to happen. And so the King of the North becomes spiritual Babylon, papacy, maybe USA. King of the South becomes spiritual Egypt. Now we have a text on that one, and that's, well, it's not a text. It is. It's Revelation chapter 11, where it talks about Egypt spiritually, and it's talking about France. So we can say France is spiritual Egypt. So the King of the South then becomes France, or atheism, or the Soviet Union. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, probably the biggest, most popular view of all of this became that Daniel 11 verse 40, King of the South pushing at him, King of the North coming against him like a whirlwind chariots and all this, was the fall of the Soviet Union. And so, for 20 years now, people have been preaching, that that was the fulfillment of Daniel 11, verse 40. But not with too much positiveness, as James White said. It's like nobody knows, really, anymore. Used to be every Adventist minister knew what these verses were all about. Now we throw up our hands and we say, well, it might be this, it might be that, and we get debates going back and forth. Some person says it might be this, and we say, what is the latest view on this? I had a view I really liked. A couple years ago, I preached it here a couple times, and that was that this is talking about 9/11. Daniel 11, verse 40 is talking about September 11, 2001. You've got the king of the south pushing at, I had made the king of the north be the United States, and then the United States goes and pushes back with all of its entering into all the countries and so forth. And I kind of liked that idea. But nobody really could say this is exactly what it is. A lot of confusion coming in. So we need to ask a basic question, and this is a very important question. Why did we give up the literal view of Daniel 11, 40 to 45? Why did we give it up? Did we give it up because it was an unbiblical method of interpretation? If we gave it up because it was an unbiblical method of interpretation, we'd have to give up everything else that we understood about Daniel 11 up until that point because we were following the same rules. You see, the Adventists who were teaching that this is talking about Turkey, they were simply following the logical next step in the progression all the way through Daniel chapter 11. And so if that was a wrong interpretation, we've got to scrap the whole thing and start over. So was it because it was an unbiblical method of interpretation? No, this was the method of interpretation that William Miller and all of our early pioneers used in establishing our prophetic understanding. William Miller said that a passage needs to be understood literally if it can. If not, look to see if there's a symbolism in there that the Bible says. Otherwise, take it literally. That was what Seventh-day Adventism and Millerism and the whole Advent movement was based on. So it wasn't because it was an unbiblical method of interpretation. The only reason we gave up our Turkey view was because what was predicted didn't happen. Well, we were kind of embarrassed. I mean, Adventist ministers have been out there preaching publicly for a long time, almost half a century, that this is what was going to happen, this is what's going to happen. And then World War I comes, everything turns around, and we gave it up. We also predicted a national Sunday law, and it never happened. So what do? Throw out our view of the National Sunday Law? Didn't happen. We got to rethink these prophecies. We got to come up with a different interpretation because that one didn't work. It almost happened in 1888, right? H.E. Jones had to go into Congress and he spoke to a special congressional committee on this thing, and he said, and he pointed out our views on religious liberty and so forth, and the idea was scrapped, and it didn't happen. So, just because something doesn't happen, is that a reason to give up our understanding of Bible prophecy? Not necessarily. The question we need to ask is, why didn't it happen? Why didn't what our pioneers taught take place? I think that's the important question we need to look at. In 1883, Ellen White wrote, and you find it in Evangelism, page 695, Had Adventists, after the Great Disappointment in 1844, held fast their faith and followed on unitedly in the opening providence of God, receiving the message of the third angel and in the power of the Holy Spirit proclaiming it to the world, they would have seen the salvation of God. The Lord would have wrought mightily with their efforts. The work would have been completed, and Christ would have come ere this to receive His people to their reward. 1883, she said, Christ would have come before now. 1883. If Seventh-day Adventists wasn't really Seventh-day Adventists in the first years, they were just Adventists. If they had held fast to their faith and followed on in the opening providence of God. She went on to say, God did not design that His people Israel should wander 40 years in the wilderness. He promised to lead them directly to the land of Canaan and establish them there a holy, healthy, happy people. But those to whom it was first preached went not in because of unbelief. For 40 years did unbelief, murmuring, and rebellion shut out ancient Israel from the land of Canaan. The same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into the heavenly Canaan. God's intention for Israel was never that they would wander 40 years, nor was it His intention the Seventh-day Adventists would wander. For how long has it been now? The Lord could have come before 1883. In the year 1900, she wrote, had the purpose of God been carried out by His people in giving to the world the message of mercy, Christ would, ere this, have come to the earth, and the saints would have received their welcome into the city of God. 1901. We may have to remain here in this world because of insubordination many more years, as did the children of Israel. 1903. I know that if the people of God had preserved a living connection with Him, if they had obeyed His word, they would today be in the heavenly Canaan. She wrote that in 1903. If we had kept our living connection with Him. There are two kinds of prophetic events. Events that are foretold in Bible prophecy. And I want you to see the difference between these. First of all, there are prophetic waymarks. These are the kinds of things that are outlined in these outline prophecies, one happening after another. Prophetic waymarks down through the history, down through the course of time. And then a second kind are the rapid final events. We're told that the final movements will be rapid ones. So you've got the prophetic waymarks happening one at a time down through time. And then at the end you have these one, just immediate, rapid final events. And it's important that we understand the difference between those as we look at this subject. If there were still waymark prophecies yet to be fulfilled, how could Ellen White say in 1883 that the Lord would have come before then? You see, our pioneers believed that everything in Daniel 11 had been fulfilled up through verse 44. All the waymark prophecies had been fulfilled. And that all was left was the final rapid movements at the end. Now let's suppose that one of these waymarks was scheduled for 1989 or 2003. How could Ellen White have said that Christ could have come before 1883 if the waymark prophecies hadn't come yet? Her statements imply that all the prophetic waymarks had been fulfilled by then. She said, we are on the very verge of the time of trouble, and perplexities that are scarcely dreamed of are before us. On the very verge. We are standing on the threshold of the crisis of the ages. This is not just motivational language. She meant what she said. We are standing, and she wrote these between 1906 and 1914. We are standing on the threshold of the crisis of the ages. In quick succession, the judgments of God will follow one another. The time of trouble such as was not since there was a nation, is right upon us. and we are like the sleeping virgins. See this language, on the very verge, on the threshold, right upon us. She was not anticipating a long, long period of time. It's been almost 100 years since 1914, the last of these statements were written. So nothing has happened in 150 years as an event foretold in Bible prophecy. I can't think of anything. You had the Lisbon earthquake in 1755. You have the Dark Day in 1780. You got the falling of the stars in 1833. And then, of course, you've got 1844, the end of the 2300-day period. But nothing has happened in 150 years as an event foretold in Bible prophecy. No prophetic waymarks have occurred since the middle of the 19th century. The reason Jesus hasn't come yet is not because he has to wait for more prophecies to be fulfilled. The only thing he's waiting for is for his people to get ready. In 1904, she wrote, "We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment." Now, she didn't say a whole lot about Daniel 11. We wish she had. This is one of the few things that she says about Daniel 11. But she says that the prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. What she's saying is all these waymarks have been going on all the way down through time, and we're down at the very end. Uriah Smith, and along with all of our other preachers, were saying that all of these things had happened. And all we're waiting for is for verse 45 to take place. This is what Ellen White said about Uriah Smith's presentation. Talking about a camp meeting. She says, Sunday morning the weather was still cloudy, but before it was time for the people to assemble, the sun shone forth. Boats and trains poured their living freight upon the ground in thousands. Elder Smith spoke in the morning upon the Eastern question. The subject was of special interest, and the people listened with the most earnest attention. We wish that Ellen White would have come right out and said what the true understanding is of Daniel 11. But what she did say, well, when Elder Smith was talking about the Eastern question, and we know what he was saying about it, he was talking about Turkey being the king of the north. He was going to set up its headquarters in Jerusalem. That's what he was saying. And as she's listening, she says the subject was of special interest. This is what she said about his book, Daniel and the Revelation. Everything that can be done should be done. Everything that can be done should be done to circulate thoughts on Daniel and Revelation. I know of no other book that can take the place of this one. It is God's helping hand. She wrote that in 1901, when the biggest subject that was being preached about and talked about was this Uriah Smith's view of Daniel and Revelation. I say Uriah Smith's view. It was held by almost all Seventh-day Adventist ministers in those days. It was right at that time when she's saying that no other book can take the place of this one. It is God's helping hand. She said, the interest in Daniel and the Revelation is to continue as long as probationary time shall last. God used the author of this book as a channel through which to communicate light to direct minds to the truth. Shall we not appreciate this light, which points us to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, our King? All she ever said was that this is a book that God has given special light in. Now here's an interesting story that you find in the biography of Ellen White, the 6-volume biography written by her grandson Arthur White. Volume 3, page 96 and 97, Arthur White writes, one of the testimonies to individuals delivered, most likely only in oral form, was addressed to James White, a reproof for his course of action just before the combined camp meeting and general conference session. He and Uriah Smith held conflicting views on the prophecy of the king of the north, pictured in Daniel 11, and the power presented in verse 45, that would come to his end with none to help him. White, in his Sabbath morning address, September 28, in the newly pitched camp meeting tent, countered Smith's interpretations. He felt that Smith's approach, indicating that the world was on the verge of Armageddon, would threaten the strong financial support needed for the rapidly expanding work of the church. Ellen White's message to her husband was a reproof for taking a course that would lead the people to observe differences of opinion among leaders and to lower their confidence in them. For the church leaders to stand in a divided position before the people was hazardous. James White accepted the reproof. So here's Ellen White upholding Uriah Smith's presentations. James White counters it in a public address, and Ellen White reproves him for it. So let's take a look at this passage from a literal perspective. And let's just see what it might be saying, just taking it as it reads. Here you have the four Greek divisions following Alexander's death. You've got Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And what happens is Seleucus kind of takes over Lysimachus's territory there. And so then you've got, in Daniel 11, a focus turns to the king of the north and the king of the south. Now this map is wrong time period, but we're going to use it to illustrate here something as we look at the flow of what's going on in Daniel chapter 11. Here you see, here's Turkey, here's Jerusalem, here's Egypt, and so forth. So what it looks like is going on in Daniel chapter 11 is a geographical transition that takes place. Two transitions, in fact. Verses 5 to 15 are talking about the king of the north and the king of the south. And we know that that's over here on the eastern side. It's the king of Syria, Turkey area versus the king of Egypt. That's what's going on in verses 5 to 15. It's on the eastern side. Then in verse 16 is introduced someone, it says, he that cometh against him. Verse 15. And at that juncture, the camera moves to the west. And between verses 16 and 39, the discussion in the chapter is over here in the west. Because there's no talk about king of the north versus king of the south in those verses. When you get to verse 40, the camera again moves because in verse 40, again you have the king of the north and the king of the south. So what has happened here, you had an initial discussion on the east side of the picture. Then the camera moved between verses 16 and 39 to the west, is talking about the leading ruling power in the west. And then in verse 40, it comes back to the east again, and we're once again discussing what's going on between the king of the north and the king of the south. It seems very clear by seeing that now that we're talking about these guys again, we must be back in the east again. So with that in mind, a literal view of this, once again, the king of the north would be the ruler of Turkey/Syria, and the king of the south would be the ruler of Egypt, if we're taking this a literal the way it's written. So Daniel 11 verse 40 says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Well, it's important that we understand when the time of the end is. It's important that we understand who the king of the south is. And we need to understand what it means that he's pushing at him. Who was the king of the south in 1798? We're looking for the name of an individual because you see, every other king of the north and south prior to this in the chapter had a name. It was a person. Egypt only had one person that could be referred to as a ruler of any kind, as a king, in 1798, and that was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the ruler of Egypt from 1798 to 1799. Well, you say, okay, that works good because he's French, and so he's the one who actually commissioned the taking of the Pope prisoner, and so there we can get the papacy in there. Well, he became the ruler of Egypt on July 1 of 1798. The Pope was taken captive in February of 1798. Napoleon wasn't the king of the South when the Pope was taken captive, so it wasn't the king of the South that was taking the Pope captive. But he was the king of the South. He was the ruler of Egypt between July 1, 1798, and about the summer, August or so of 1799. Now here's a map that I found. It's entitled Napoleon's Campaign in Egypt, 1798. And what he did was he came in here and he took over Egypt. He set up new government. He just took over, started building buildings, setting up administration, and things like that. And so here he is, the king of the South. And let's read what it says. Verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the South push at him. This is taken from Wikipedia article on Napoleon. It says, in early 1799, he, Napoleon, moved an army into the Ottoman province of Damascus, Syria and Galilee. Bonaparte led these 13,000 French soldiers in the conquest of the coastal towns of Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. The attack on Jaffa was particularly brutal. Now here's these towns. There's Gaza, Jaffa, there's Arish. And so this was Napoleon as the king of the South, moving against the king of the North, which was the king of Syria, and this was considered Syria territory. Keep in mind, this was the Ottoman Empire. We saw the map earlier where all of Turkey, Syria, all the way down through Palestine, all was controlled from Constantinople. So, what do we have? We have the king of the South, General Bonaparte, going up and attacking or pushing at the king of the North at the time of the end. I used to want to read this as, and in the time of the end. That means you could have it any time after 1798. But it doesn't say that. It says, and at the time of the end, indicating that it has to happen at that point. Now, when is that? If you go up to verse 35 of Daniel chapter 11, it says, and some of them of understanding shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. The time of the end would begin at the appointed time when this time of persecution of God's people would end. So at the end of this appointed time, there's only 2 appointed times of persecution in the Bible that were appointed times for God's people to be persecuted. One was the 10 days of Revelation chapter 2, which took place in the days of Emperor Diocletian, 10 years, 303 to 313. The only other appointed time for persecution of God's people was 538 to 1798. And that's the one we're talking about here. At the end of that time period would be the time of the end, according to Daniel 11:35. So we're looking for Daniel 11, we're looking for in 1798, at the time of the end, the king of the South, and Napoleon was the king of the South at the time of the end. Here he's moving into Syria. Now notice what happens. Bonaparte, on discovering many of the defenders were former prisoners of war, he's talking about Jaffa. By the way, that's the biblical Joppa. Discovering that many of the defenders were former prisoners of war, ostensibly on parole, ordered the garrison and the 1,400 prisoners to be executed by bayonet or drowning to save bullets. Men, women, and children were robbed and murdered for 3 days. Now, the word for push here, at the time of the end shall the king of the South push at him, is also translated in the Bible gore, to gore, as like with a tusk or a sharp-pointed object. And so, shall the king of the South gore at him? What better word could they use to describe a bayonet massacre. And then it says, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. Well, that's exactly what happened. When General Bonaparte reached the coastal town of Acre, and that's up here, the tide of the war turned in favor of the Sultan's forces. Not only did Napoleon there encounter the newly formed Ottoman infantry elites, but the Sultan had also assembled a large army to attack from Asia, while from the sea came fleets of Ottoman and British warships. And so these next verses are all described in that event where there was a big, like a whirlwind, response to that. So the literal view of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, you've got Bonaparte as the king of the south in verse 40. You've got the Turks aided by the British fulfilling verses 40 to 43. You've got the Crimean War still fulfilling verse 44. And what's going on there? If you'll look at verse 44, it says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, talking about the king of the north. On the east is Persia, on the north was Russia. And if you read in the old editions of Daniel and the Revelation, it explains how Persia and Russia were putting threats on Turkey. And so in retaliation or to prevent something, what happens is Turkey attacks, and that's what the Crimean War was all about, just the way it's described here. So what you've got here is a literal view. You've got everything having happened by 1856. Everything has happened except verse 44. And all that we're waiting for now is for verse 45 to take place. It's like since 1856, the pause button had been pushed on this prophecy. Ellen White had said the prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Everything had happened up and through verse 44, and then the pause button was pushed because of the insubordination of God's people, the unreadiness. God couldn't continue the prophecy happening. All the waymarks had been fulfilled, but He couldn't bring on the final events because God's people weren't ready. And so the prophecy went on pause. Revelation 7, verses 2 and 3 says, and I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. That's what God is waiting for. The sealing of His servants in the foreheads, until Christ's character is perfectly reproduced in His people, until God's people are so filled with the Spirit of Christ that they have no desire to do anything but to serve the Lord completely and fully, until God's Spirit seals them in their foreheads. And when that happens, then the play button can be pushed again, and the prophecy goes into those final, rapid events that finish things up. Manuscript Release, Volume 1, page 145, says, 4 mighty angels hold back the powers of this earth till the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads. The nations of the world are eager for conflict, but they are held in check by the angels. When this restraining power is removed, there will come a time of trouble and anguish. Deadly instruments of warfare will be invented, but they are to be kept under control till the time shall come for the great battle of Armageddon. Powers of earth are held in check till God's people can be sealed in their foreheads. And then all of this warfare takes place. Now let's go to Daniel 11, verse 45. It says, and he, it's talking about the king of the north. So we need to find out who the king of the north is. Well, this is a current map of that same area. Who's up here? Well, you've got Turkey, you've got Syria and Lebanon. The biggest force, of course, is Turkey, just as it was in Uriah Smith's day. It doesn't have as much territory as it had then, but it's still up there. And then there's Israel down here. So, this was our pioneer understanding. We're looking at this from a literal perspective. What's happening here literally taking place. If we don't try to spiritualize it into something spiritual, whatever. The Bible says, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Well, the tabernacles of his palace is his headquarters, his central authority. It's going to be planted between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. So what's the glorious holy mountain? Well, in Daniel 9, verse 16, Daniel says, I beseech thee, let thine anger and thy fury be turned away from thy city Jerusalem, thy holy mountain. So Jerusalem is referred to as God's holy mountain. In Daniel 11, verse 16, it says, he shall stand in the glorious land. That's talking about Rome. When Rome comes into the prophecy, he went and he conquered Syria and Judea, and that's what that was talking about. So the glorious land in Daniel 11:16, same chapter, is Judea. So when Daniel 11, verse 45 says he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, Daniel has already told us what the holy mountain is and what the glorious land is. And so what we're seeing here is he will plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. And that's exactly how our pioneers understood this passage. Now we can say, that's not according to current thought. Well, current thought doesn't know what to think. When I had this other view of this spiritual idea, it was kind of exciting because it was something new, but I had nothing to stand on. I couldn't say, yes, this is what it is. But this is what our pioneers taught. This is what was in the book that was endorsed by Sister White. This was understood and no one questioned it except for a few. James White questioned it. This is from Gulf News. The headline, Israel fears Turkey's changing stance. This is a little over a year ago. It says, over the past few years, Israel has been concerned about a possible shift in Turkey's foreign policy orientation. Israeli analysts have been trying to assess the impact of Turkey's efforts to regain its status as a regional power in the Middle East on its relationship with Israel. Some speculated that as Ankara proceeded with its endeavors to forge closer ties with its neighbors and assume a leading role in the Middle East, notice, it wants to assume a leading role in the Middle East, its relationship with Israel would suffer. Few expected, however, that Turkey would have the courage to ditch its alliance with Israel and turn instead to its foes. Should Turkey's relations with Syria and Iran reach that level, Israel's worst nightmare would have come true. Here's another one, another website here. Turkey, Israel, and war. It says Turkey, for hundreds of years, was the seat of the Islamic Caliphate in the Mideast and sometimes beyond, and was known as the Ottoman Empire when it was defeated with Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary in World War I. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity and was forced to cede its territories to the alliance of France, Great Britain, and the U.S. World War I victors formed the League of Nations with American President Woodrow Wilson's prodding, which designated the Ottoman territories as mandates to be administered by France and England. And then it goes on, and we'll just look at portions of this. It says, Turkey rapidly strengthens its ties with Iran, Syria, and Russia. Turkey has decided to cast its lot once again with the Islamic communist Eastern Axis. The benefits to Turkey of taking an adversarial stance with Israel become greater as it looks once again not only to be one of the boys in the Islamic world, but to assume leadership in the Islamic world. There's a good chance that Israel would eventually attack Iran's nuclear facilities as it did Iraq's and Syria's, and Turkey would join the counterattack. This is just some of the things that it's talking about here. Here's another one. Another website, Caliph will sit in Jerusalem. Head of the northern faction of the Islamic movement, Sheikh Raid Salah, said Friday that soon Jerusalem will be the capital of the new Muslim caliphate and the caliph's seat will be there. Now this is just stuff in the news. Now this one is a few years old. But that's what they're wanting to do. That's what is being talked about. Now, does it look so much stranger now that a literal interpretation of this could happen? Is it mere coincidence that today, as unprecedented calls for revival are sweeping through the Seventh-day Adventist Church, events in the Middle East are returning to a condition in which Daniel 11:45 can be fulfilled literally as our pioneers predicted a century ago? It looks like the pause button is about to be released. It looks like things are set up not only so that things can happen the way they were predicted to happen, but that is happening at the very time when God's people are being called to revival and reformation. Because God is about to release that pause button. And the prophecies will then continue to take place. The rapid final ones. So here's the headlines. How Egyptians toppled Mubarak and who will lead them now. Following yesterday's resignation of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, the big question is, what will the future of Egypt look like? It is understood that the best organized political influence in Egypt is the Muslim Brotherhood. You've probably been hearing about them over the last week or two. So I looked up the Muslim Brotherhood. Who are these guys? In the group's belief, the Quran and Sunnah constitute the perfect way of life and social and political organization that God has set out for man. Islamic governments must be based on this system and eventually united in a caliphate. What's a caliphate? You've seen that word here. A week or so ago, that word became the top search on Google. Well, it's the head of a unified Muslim world. It was disbanded in 1924, following, of course, World War I and all the changes that were made there, and the new Republic of Turkey set up and everything. They disbanded. The caliphate ceased to exist. But that at that time in Constantinople was the head of the whole Islamic world. Now, this is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is probably the most influential political group that's the most organized in the various factions in Egypt right now. The Muslim Brotherhood's goal, as stated by Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna, was to reclaim Islam's manifest destiny, an empire stretching from Spain to Indonesia. That's the goal of this. In fact, one of the primary goals of the Muslim Brotherhood listed on Wikipedia, the number one goal is, and here's the quote, reinstatement of the caliphate and reunite the Dar al-Islam, which is this unity of all of the Muslim nations. So the Bible said, when that happens, when he plants the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, then it says, yet shall he come to his end, and none shall help him, and at that time shall Michael stand up. At that time, God's people have been sealed in their foreheads. Probation closes. The time of trouble begins. And then Jesus soon comes. That's what happens. You see, I believe that we don't have to wait for more fulfillments of waymark prophecies. I believe that Jesus has simply been waiting for us. And that's why it is so important that now, when this focus on revival is coming through, that we be on board, that we be part of the plan that God has for His church. It's going to happen with or without you. I want to be part of it. I want to be one who is sealed with the seal of the living God. I want to be one who has Christ's character fully developed in me, because we're right down at the very end. I'd like us to read as we close our scripture reading that we had this morning in the book of Romans, chapter 13, verses 11 and 12. It says, "And that, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light."